7 years had slipped through the hourglass since the last time David looked into Victoria's eyes. Even with the passage of so much time, there were long, quiet nights when her memory crashed over him with such an overwhelming force that it felt as though absolutely no time had passed at all. He remembered the radiant warmth of her smile, the gentle way she could always unearth a sliver of hope even on their darkest, most challenging days, and the profound, unwavering belief in her gaze whenever he spoke of his ambitious dreams. For the longest time, he had desperately convinced himself that walking away was the most selfless, logical decision he could make for both of their futures. He was entirely consumed by the absolute certainty that he needed to forge a formidable career and secure unquestionable financial stability before he could ever offer her the comfortable, beautiful life she so richly deserved. However, the relentless march of time often reveals that life rarely adheres to the meticulously crafted blueprints one draws up in their youth. Now, as a highly successful entrepreneur at 35 years old, David had seemingly conquered the world. He had managed to acquire everything he had tirelessly toiled for over the past 7 years: widespread industry recognition, immense economic stability, and an enviable sterling reputation within the fiercely competitive business circles of the United States of America. He was a man who commanded boardrooms across the nation. Yet, in the lingering moments of profound silence, when the high-stakes meetings concluded and the blinding lights of the towering corporate skyscrapers were extinguished, a suffocating emptiness settled deep within his chest, a void that no amount of financial triumph or public adulation could ever hope to fill. On this particular crisp, windswept afternoon, David arrived at the Grand Lakeside Hotel in the heart of Chicago, Illinois, preparing to attend a critical summit with a syndicate of elite investors. The architectural marvel of the hotel was truly breathtaking, standing as a testament to the city's historic grandeur. Its colossal glass windows brilliantly reflected the golden dying embers of the autumn sunset, while the immaculate, sophisticated entrance was bordered by perfectly manicured botanical gardens that seemed to defy the bustling urban chaos surrounding them. A sharply dressed valet gracefully opened the door of his sleek midnight blue luxury sedan, and David stepped out onto the pavement, habitually adjusting the lapels of his custom-tailored charcoal suit. He was silently rehearsing the intricate financial details of the upcoming merger in his mind when a sudden, inexplicable shift in the atmosphere drew his gaze across the expansive entrance courtyard. A solitary woman was walking with quiet purpose toward the grand revolving doors of the hotel. At first glance, she was merely an anonymous silhouette, blending into the constant ebb and flow of wealthy guests and hurried staff members moving throughout the busy thoroughfare. But as a sudden gust of the famous Chicago wind prompted her to lift her face slightly to brush a stray lock of hair from her eyes, David felt the very fabric of time grind to an absolute agonizing halt. It was Victoria. The sudden shock caused his heart to violently slam against his ribs, skipping a beat in a way that left him momentarily breathless. For a fleeting, desperate second, he truly believed his exhausted mind was playing cruel, hallucinatory tricks on him. After 7 long, agonizing years of silence, he had never in his wildest imaginations expected their paths to cross in this sprawling, million-strong metropolis. He stood frozen on the pavement, watching her in absolute silence. She had undoubtedly changed, just as the passage of years dictates for everyone. Her soft features now bore a quiet, graceful maturity and a profound serenity that he had not known before, yet she remained undeniably the exact same woman he had once loved with every fiber of his being. Her dark, lustrous hair cascaded in gentle waves, catching the evening breeze as she walked with a newly acquired confident stride toward the opulent main entrance. A massive, uncontrollable flood of deeply buried memories violently inundated David's racing mind. He instantly recalled the countless lazy Sunday afternoons they had spent tangled together, whispering excitedly about their shared visions for the future. He remembered the sacred, tear-soaked promises they had exchanged on the gloomy evening before he finally boarded that plane, the bitter, heartbreaking argument that had ultimately sealed their tragic fate, and the suffocating heavy silence that had haunted his life ever since. For 7 years, he had endlessly rehearsed what he might do if the universe ever granted him the grace of seeing her face just one more time. He had meticulously composed 1,000 different apologies, planning to beg for her forgiveness for every foolish mistake he had made and every teardrop he had caused. He had constantly imagined finding the perfect words to articulate the unbearable magnitude of how much he had missed her presence in his life. Yet now, standing merely 50 feet away from the only woman who had ever truly mattered to his soul, his throat constricted, his mind went entirely blank, and he found himself utterly incapable of uttering a single syllable. Driven by an instinct older than reason, David slowly began to place one foot in front of the other, magnetically pulled in her direction through the crowd of elegantly dressed hotel guests. However, just before he could close the distance and call out her name, a high-pitched, incredibly joyful little voice pierced the ambient noise of the courtyard from somewhere just behind her. "Mommy, wait for me." David's footsteps faltered instantly, his polished shoes freezing against the stone pavement as if cemented in place. A beautiful little girl who appeared to be about 6 years old came sprinting joyfully from the direction of the adjacent guest parking promenade. The little girl was wearing a pristine pale yellow sundress with a brightly colored, whimsical children's backpack slung carelessly over one tiny shoulder. She was running as fast as her little legs could carry her, a brilliant gap-toothed smile illuminating her face as she desperately tried to catch up to Victoria. Hearing the sweet voice, Victoria immediately stopped and turned around, her entire countenance instantly melting into an expression of pure, unconditional, maternal tenderness. "Samantha, please slow down, sweetheart," she called out in that melodious voice David remembered so well, gently reaching out to firmly grasp the little girl's hand in her own. The entire scene unfolding before David's eyes felt devastatingly natural and perfectly complete. The boundless warmth in Victoria's radiant smile, the pure, unadulterated happiness radiating from the little girl, and the absolute unshakable trust with which she had called out the word, "Mommy." Standing there in the chilling Chicago breeze, David felt a sudden crushing weight press down upon his chest, threatening to shatter his ribs. For 7 long years, he had secretly nurtured a fragile, desperate flame of hope that perhaps one day they might miraculously find their way back to one another and rewrite their ending. But hearing that one simple 2-syllable word violently extinguished every last ember of those lingering illusions. Victoria had a child, a beautiful daughter, and she appeared completely, undeniably happy without him. David slowly lowered his gaze to the cold concrete, a profound sense of failure washing over him. He realized, with agonizing clarity, that he had arrived far too late. While he had remained emotionally paralyzed, hopelessly trapped within the gilded cage of his past memories and professional ambitions, Victoria's life had beautifully and naturally moved forward. He was just about to turn away to retreat to his luxury vehicle and instruct the driver to take him far away from this painful revelation when a sudden flash of silver caught his eye. The little girl, Samantha, was wearing a delicate gleaming silver pendant suspended on a thin chain around her neck. Initially, David dismissed it as a random piece of children's jewelry, but as the dying rays of the Chicago sun struck the metal perfectly, sending a bright reflection toward him, an intense shiver violently ran down his spine. He recognized the intricate, unique design of that silver pendant with absolute terrifying certainty. Many years ago, when he was just a struggling, impoverished student, He had worked grueling double shifts for several grueling weeks, simply to scrape together enough cash to purchase that exact necklace. It was by no means an expensive or luxurious piece of jewelry, but it carried an immeasurable, priceless, sentimental weight. He had proudly placed it around Victoria's neck on the very night they had tearfully sworn to never under any circumstances forget the love they shared. David stood paralyzed, watching in stunned disbelief as the cherished silver pendant rested gently against the little girl's chest. The mathematical probability of this being a mere coincidence was astronomically low. As Victoria and little Samantha happily walked through the polished brass revolving doors and disappeared into the lavish hotel lobby, a strange, overwhelming intuition began to swell violently within his chest. There was a vital piece of the puzzle missing, a massive, unrevealed truth hovering just beneath the surface of this encounter. For the first time in 7 arduous years, David felt as though destiny had forcefully kicked open a heavy door that he had assumed was locked for all eternity. Later that evening, inside a private oak-paneled dining room overlooking the shimmering waters of Lake Michigan, David found it utterly impossible to focus on the high-stakes financial summit for which he had traveled across the country. The distinguished investors, including the stern, highly respected Arthur Harrison and the sharp-witted Eleanor Sterling, passionately discussed quarterly projections, lucrative expansion contracts, and ambitious future development projects. Yet, despite millions of dollars being casually tossed across the table in negotiation, David's mind was anchored completely to the courtyard below. Over and over again, like a relentless film reel trapped on a loop, he visualized the image of Victoria gracefully walking into the hotel lobby alongside the cheerful little Samantha. Above all else, his thoughts remained violently fixated on the unmistakable delicate silver pendant resting against the child's dress. When the grueling 4-hour meeting finally adjourned, and he retreated to the solitary confines of his luxurious penthouse suite, he desperately attempted to rationalize the situation and convince his racing heart that he was irrationally overreacting to a simple piece of jewelry. He paced the length of the plush carpet, whispering logical excuses into the silent room. Perhaps Victoria had merely kept the inexpensive silver necklace tucked away in a drawer for 7 years out of simple nostalgia. As many affectionate mothers often do with cherished keepsakes from their youth, she might have innocently passed it down to her daughter because the child found it pretty. He tried to force himself to believe that it meant absolutely nothing. There was absolutely no rational reason for it to hold any deeper life-altering significance regarding his own existence. Yet, despite his best efforts to drown the thought in logic, a primal, undeniable instinct buried deep within his soul screamed that there was an intricate, profound history hidden behind that silver necklace. He tossed and turned violently throughout the night the luxurious high-thread count sheets, feeling like coarse sandpaper against his skin as sleep continually evaded his grasp. By the time the first faint hues of morning light began to bleed through the sheer curtains, coloring the Chicago skyline in soft pinks and purples, David had already made a resolute, unshakable decision. He arrived downstairs in the bustling, marble-floored lobby of the Grand Lakeside Hotel, a full 3 hours before his scheduled morning itinerary required him to be there. Officially, his presence was required to review a series of dense legal documents pertaining to a massive corporate collaboration with a local tech firm. However, the absolute truth was that he was desperately single-mindedly hoping for a second chance to lay his eyes upon Victoria. He slowly walked through the elegant, bustling corridors, his keen eyes scanning the continuous chaotic movement of the uniformed hotel staff and the wealthy vacationing guests. It was during this slow, deliberate patrol that he suddenly spotted her. Victoria was standing near the towering, ornate mahogany doors of the hotel's grandest ballroom, deeply engaged in a serious conversation with several event staff members and her young, energetic assistant, Chloe. Victoria appeared incredibly poised and entirely consumed by the demanding nature of her professional responsibilities. She was confidently issuing clear directives, meticulously reviewing endless clipboards of scheduling documents, and efficiently resolving last-minute catering crises with a commanding authority that completely captivated David's attention. He stepped behind a large marble pillar, allowing himself a few stolen moments to simply observe her from a safe distance. A profound, overwhelming sense of pride swelled within his chest as he witnessed the remarkably strong, fiercely independent professional woman she had blossomed into. She was undeniably no longer the slightly timid, chronically insecure young girl he had known and left behind 7 years ago. The woman standing before him radiated an aura of quiet power, unwavering confidence, and an inspiring determination that left him completely breathless. Finally realizing he could not hide in the shadows forever, he drew in a massive, steadying breath, summoning every ounce of courage he possessed, and slowly stepped out into the open hallway. He walked with measured steps until he was standing just a few feet away from her busy circle. "Victoria," he said, his voice slightly rough, yet carrying enough volume to cut through the ambient noise of the busy corridor. At the sound of her name, Victoria abruptly stopped speaking to Chloe and slowly raised her head. For several agonizing, infinitely long seconds, the bustling noise of the Chicago hotel seemed to completely fade away, and neither of them dared to breathe a single word. Absolute, unadulterated shock instantly washed over her delicate features, her eyes widening as they locked onto his. Hearing his name desperately whispered by the very voice he had obsessively dreamed about for 7 years caused David's heart to hammer violently against his ribs. "David!" She finally breathed out the word, carrying a heavy mixture of disbelief and an emotion he couldn't quite decipher. "Hello?" he responded softly, managing to offer a small, slightly trembling smile. Victoria stood frozen, requiring several long, excruciating moments to fully process the reality of the man standing before her. I honestly never expected to see you here in this city." She stammered, her usual professional composure momentarily fracturing. "I certainly did not expect to find you here either," David replied, his eyes intensely searching hers for any sign of welcome. She quickly lowered her gaze to the floor, for a brief second appearing just as intensely overwhelmed and disoriented by the unexpected reunion as he was. After a prolonged, suffocatingly awkward silence, they slowly began to converse, stepping slightly away from the curious gaze of her assistant Chloe. In the beginning, their conversation remained strictly guarded and painfully superficial. They politely exchanged pleasantries about their respective careers, the brutal winter weather of Chicago, and the staggering number of years that had evaporated since they last spoke. Yet, swimming dangerously just beneath the polite surface of every single syllable were turbulent, heavy emotions and unspoken histories that neither of them possessed the immediate bravery to drag into the light. David felt an agonizing, desperate urge to ask her 1,000 different questions. He desperately wanted to know every single detail about how her life had unfolded during the 7 years they spent apart. He wanted to know if in the quiet moments of her life she had ever allowed herself to think about him. More than anything in the world, he desperately needed to know if she had found it in her heart to forgive him for walking away. However, the suffocating fear of rejection kept his lips tightly sealed, and none of those burning questions managed to escape his mouth. As they continued their cautious verbal dance, David's sharp instincts noticed something peculiar. Victoria maintained a polite, tranquil facade, but during certain fleeting moments, her beautiful eyes betrayed a frantic, underlying nervousness. She kept subtly shifting her weight, constantly glancing toward the hallway corridors, as if she were deeply terrified that their innocent conversation might suddenly veer into a highly dangerous, specific territory. And David, guided by the haunting memory of the previous afternoon, Strongly suspected he knew exactly what that forbidden topic was. Gathering his courage, he finally decided to breach the unspoken barrier. "The little girl from yesterday afternoon," he began, letting the sentence hang heavily in the air between them. Victoria's head snapped up immediately, a sudden flash of panic illuminating her eyes. "Samantha," she whispered defensively. "Yes," David continued, trying desperately to keep his voice sounding casual and completely natural. "She seems like an absolutely charming little girl." A genuine, fiercely protective smile briefly broke through Victoria's anxious facade. "She truly is. You must be incredibly proud of her," David added, watching her reactions like a hawk. "Far more than you could possibly imagine." Victoria replied, her voice thick with sudden, unexplained emotion. For a long, tense moment, a profound silence descended upon them once again. Then, keeping his gaze locked entirely on hers, David softly asked the question that had been burning a hole in his soul. "Exactly how old is she?" Victoria's facial expression shifted violently for merely a fraction of a second. It was a microscopic, incredibly subtle detail, but David's observant eyes caught it immediately. "She is 6 years old." Victoria answered, her voice suddenly trembling, losing its steady professional cadence. That specific numerical answer acted like a violent earthquake within David's mind. 6 years old. David instantly performed a frantic, desperate mental calculation, aligning the months of her pregnancy with the exact date of his departure 7 years ago. It was a bizarre coincidence, far too impossible, and perfectly aligned to be a simple trick of fate. Before he could press the issue further, or articulate the massive suspicion growing in his chest, a cheerful, high-pitched voice shattered the tense atmosphere. "Mommy!" little Samantha shouted joyfully as she came sprinting down the luxuriously carpeted hallway. She was tightly clutching a thick stack of brightly colored crayon drawings in her tiny hands, and an enormous infectious smile completely dominated her adorable face. Upon reaching Victoria, she threw her arms around her mother's waist, hugging her with a fierce, unconditional love. David stood perfectly still, taking the opportunity to observe the little girl from a much closer distance. And it was in that precise, fateful moment that a monumental discovery sent a violent, freezing chill racing down the entire length of his spine. As the little girl turned her head to giggle at something, Victoria whispered, her dark hair shifted, exposing the delicate skin just behind her left ear. Resting perfectly, there was a distinct crescent-shaped birthmark. It was an absolutely identical replica of the mark he carried. It possessed the exact same unusual shape, positioned in the exact same specific peculiar location. David felt the warm blood instantly drain from his face, leaving him pale and lightheaded. That specific birthmark was an exceptionally rare genetic trait. Every single male in his bloodline possessed it: his father, his grandfather, and even faded sepia-toned antique photographs proved the existence of the identical characteristic in generations long past. Victoria, possessing an intimate knowledge of his family history, instinctively followed the exact trajectory of his shocked gaze. The very second she comprehended exactly what he was staring at, with such undisguised horror and awe, her entire demeanor collapsed completely. The warm, maternal smile instantly vanished from her lips. Her eyes filled with a deep, profound terror, reflecting the agonizing realization that the very moment she had spent the last 7 years dreading and attempting to avoid had finally arrived. David felt as though all the oxygen had been violently sucked out of the grand corridor. He could barely manage to draw breath into his burning lungs. He stared intently at the innocent little girl, then slowly shifted his disbelieving gaze to Victoria, and then back to the beautiful child holding the crayons. Like a magnificent complex puzzle finally assembling itself, the scattered confusing pieces began to lock perfectly into place within his racing mind. The silver sentimental pendant, the exact mathematical age of little Samantha, the undeniably rare genetic birthmark, the overlapping timelines, the impossible coincidences, every single detail flawlessly wove together to form one massive, undeniable truth. It was a heavy, life-altering reality that up until this very second had remained completely and purposefully hidden in the shadows of the past. Victoria! He finally managed to say, his voice trembling so violently it barely sounded like his own. Hearing his broken tone, Victoria slowly closed her eyes for several long, agonizing seconds. She appeared to be fighting a massive internal war, surrendering to the harsh reality that the heavy curtain of secrecy she had desperately maintained for 7 years was finally falling. Little Samantha simply stood there, blinking her large, innocent eyes, looking back and forth between the two adults, completely unable to comprehend the massive emotional storm brewing around her. David took one slow, deliberate step forward, closing the distance between them. "I need you to look me in the eyes and tell me the absolute truth," he demanded gently, yet with an immovable firmness. Victoria slowly opened her tear-filled eyes. The heavy, unshed tears had finally begun to gather rapidly, threatening to spill over her dark eyelashes. For 7 incredibly long, difficult years, she had fiercely guarded this massive secret. For 7 years, she had carried the crushing weight of a complicated history entirely on her own shoulders, never once imagining that she would eventually be forced to confront the past in the middle of a busy hotel corridor in Chicago. Finally, she lowered her gaze, unable to maintain eye contact, and drew in a deep, shuddering breath that seemed to pull from the very depths of her soul. When she finally found the courage to speak, her voice was nothing more than a fragile, broken whisper. "There is something incredibly important that I never managed to tell you." She began, a single tear escaping and tracing a path down her cheek. David felt as if his loudly beating heart had stopped completely within his chest, waiting for the words that would inevitably rewrite his entire existence. And then, slowly turning her loving gaze to look down at the confused little Samantha, Victoria finally uttered the heavy, impossible words that would irrevocably alter the trajectory of all 3 of their lives forever. "She is your daughter." The devastatingly heavy words that Victoria had just spoken remained suspended in the tense air between them, feeling as though the universe itself had decided to pause its relentless rotation. "She is your daughter." David stood absolutely motionless, frozen like a marble statue in the center of the luxurious hotel corridor. For several agonizingly long seconds, he was physically and mentally incapable of producing a single reaction. His highly analytical business mind was desperately trying to process and comprehend the monumental weight of the revelation he had just heard, but the raw, unadulterated emotion flooding his system was far too intense to manage. He slowly looked down at little Samantha. The innocent child was still happily clutching her brightly colored drawings, completely oblivious to the massive shift in the universe, utterly unable to understand why the 2 adults standing above her had suddenly become so incredibly nervous and emotional. Then David slowly dragged his stunned gaze back up to meet Victoria's tear-filled eyes. "My daughter." He whispered the 2 words, tasting foreign yet incredibly sacred on his tongue. Thick, heavy tears finally broke free, beginning to slide rapidly down Victoria's flushed cheeks. "Yes," she choked out, her voice barely audible. In that profound moment, David experienced a violent, chaotic mixture of intense emotions that were completely impossible to accurately describe. Utter shock, boundless happiness, crushing sadness, immense guilt, and a strange, profound relief all crashed together violently inside his soul at the exact same time. "Why in the world did you never tell me?" he asked, his voice cracking under the emotional strain. Victoria looked away, wiping a tear from her chin. I genuinely tried to. David, she pleaded softly. Those 4 simple words forced David into a stunned, reflective silence, prompting Victoria to finally explain the heartbreaking reality of the past 7 years. She detailed how merely a few short weeks after he had boarded that plane to chase his corporate ambitions across the country, she had discovered she was pregnant. Initially, she had been desperate to share the life-altering news with him immediately. However, she had tragically lost all avenues of contact. His old cellular number had been disconnected without warning. Every single electronic email she sent had frustratingly bounced back, marked as undeliverable. She had even desperately attempted to track him down by contacting his old university friends, but nobody seemed to know exactly which city he had moved to or which company he was working for. As the difficult, lonely months slowly passed, she eventually came to the terrifying realization that she would be forced to face the massive responsibility of motherhood entirely alone. It was not an easy journey. She recounted the terrifying moments when she felt utterly consumed by fear, the exhausting nights working double shifts at local diners, and the countless times she had nearly surrendered to despair. Yet, she explained, every single time she looked down and saw her beautiful baby girl's smile, she miraculously found the hidden strength necessary to keep fighting and pushing forward. I swear to you, I never kept Samantha a secret out of spite or malice. Victoria sobbed, the emotional dam finally breaking completely. It simply reached a point where so many years had passed, and you had become so incredibly successful and distant, that I truly believed it was far too late to disrupt your perfect life. Hearing her painful confession, David felt a profound, sharp agony pierce his heart. It was not out of anger that she had kept the secret, but rather born from the crushing realization of exactly how much precious time he had squandered. He had missed her very first uncertain footsteps, her magical first spoken words, her joyful birthday parties, her sad tears, and her innocent laughter. He had selfishly thrown away 7 entire years of the life of the most important human being he had ever helped create. Meanwhile, Samantha stood patiently watching the 2 weeping adults with a growing sense of sweet, childlike curiosity. "Why are both of you crying so much?" she finally asked, her tiny voice filled with innocent concern. Hearing her sweet voice, David slowly sank to his knees, right there on the carpeted floor, bringing himself down to her eye level. For the very first time, he did not look at her as a strange, random child in a hotel, but rather as his own flesh and blood, his very own daughter. "Because, sweetheart." David responded, fighting through his tears to produce the most genuine, emotionally radiant smile he had ever worn. "I am just so incredibly happy to finally meet you." Hikik, the little girl, tilted her head slightly, studying his face intently. "Are you really?" she asked softly. "Yes," David whispered, his heart bursting. "More than anything in the world." Samantha smiled innocently, and that single pure expression instantly reignited a bright, blazing light deep within David's soul that had been completely extinguished for 7 long years. Throughout the passing of the next several weeks, the 3 of them slowly embarked on the delicate, beautiful process of getting to know one another. David fundamentally understood that no amount of money or wishing could ever magically rewind the clock and recover the 7 precious years he had lost. However, he also realized with absolute clarity that he possessed the power to maximize the value of every single moment that still lay ahead of them. He began visiting Samantha and Victoria every single opportunity he could carve out of his demanding schedule, effectively putting his corporate empire on hold to prioritize his newfound family in Chicago. He would patiently sit at Victoria's small kitchen table, helping the little girl painstakingly complete her first-grade homework assignments. On bright, sunny weekend afternoons, he would take them to the beautiful Millennium Park, pushing Samantha on the swings, while carefully listening to her endless, enthusiastic stories about her elementary school friends, her wild, imaginative dreams, and her completely fabricated magical adventures. In the very beginning, the young girl was understandably quite shy and reserved around him. It was a completely natural reaction. After all, this tall, wealthy stranger had abruptly materialized out of nowhere and inserted himself into the quiet, routine life she shared exclusively with her mother. But slowly, gently, day by day, the invisible walls began to crumble, and she started to place her pure, innocent trust in him. One particularly beautiful autumn afternoon, while they were leisurely walking down the vibrant, bustling Navy Pier, looking out over the vast blue expanse of Lake Michigan, Samantha instinctively reached up and tightly grabbed his large hand. It was an incredibly simple, spontaneous gesture. Yet, for David, feeling those tiny fingers wrapped securely around his own meant infinitely more than any massive corporate acquisition, glowing press release, or astronomical financial milestone he had ever achieved in his entire career. In that exact quiet moment of connection, he finally comprehended that true, authentic success could never be accurately measured by bank account balances or ruthless business victories. True success was measured exclusively by the depth of the relationships we nurture and the people we fiercely love. During this beautiful period of familial discovery, David also slowly began to bridge the massive emotional chasm that existed between him and Victoria. This time, however, their connection was completely devoid of empty, naive promises, impossibly grand dreams, or foolishly rushed plans for the future. The punishing passage of time had profoundly changed both of them. They had matured through their respective hardships, and they both now deeply understood the supreme, foundational value of open communication, unwavering trust, and the incredible healing power of genuine forgiveness. They spent countless evenings sitting on Victoria's porch, drinking coffee and talking for hours, carefully unpacking the heavy baggage of their shared past. Victoria introduced David to Eleanor Higgins, an older, incredibly kind neighborhood woman who had acted as a surrogate grandmother and mentor during the darkest, most difficult days of her single motherhood. David made a point to personally thank Eleanor, his heart overflowing with immense gratitude for the woman who had protected his family when he was foolishly chasing shadows across the country. As the harsh Chicago winter slowly began to thaw, giving way to the gentle blooming promises of spring, David realized that his life had entirely transformed. The suffocating emptiness that had once plagued his quiet nights was completely gone, replaced by the chaotic, beautiful, noisy reality of fatherhood and rekindled love. He watched Victoria laugh as Samantha chased pigeons near the lake, and he knew with absolute, unshakable certainty that he was finally, truly home. He knew that he never wanted to spend another day of his existence apart from the two incredible women who had completely redefined his understanding of purpose. It was time to permanently solidify the miraculous second chance the universe had generously provided. He began meticulously planning an event, keeping the details a strict secret from Victoria, ensuring that the next step they took would flawlessly honor the incredible journey they had survived to find their way back to one another. Several beautiful, transformative months later, David meticulously organized an incredibly elegant private dinner banquet within the grandest ballroom of the Grand Lakeside Hotel, the exact same historic building where the chaotic, beautiful hand of destiny had so abruptly forced their divergent paths to cross once more. A carefully curated group of intimate family members, close lifelong friends, and supportive colleagues from David's revitalized corporate firm attended the joyous event. Victoria arrived looking absolutely breathtaking, completely unaware of the true hidden purpose behind the extravagant gathering. She had simply assumed that David had arranged the lavish evening as a generous celebration of a recent highly successful business merger he had finalized. However, as the multi-course dinner elegantly concluded, and the waitstaff quietly retreated to the edges of the room, David slowly stood up from the head table and gently tapped a silver spoon against his crystal water glass, requesting the attention of the room. The ambient chatter instantly died down, and a respectful, expectant silence washed over the elegantly dressed attendees. David stepped forward and sincerely admitted that his pursuit of success had cost him the woman he truly loved and the chance to watch his daughter grow up. Grateful for the unexpected second chance life had given him, he knelt before Victoria, presented a diamond ring, and asked her to spend the rest of their lives with him. Overcome with emotion, Victoria accepted, and the ballroom erupted in applause as little Samantha embraced them both. In that joyful moment, David realized that the greatest treasures in life are not wealth or ambition, but the people we love and the family we choose to cherish. Their reunion became a reminder that true happiness comes not from avoiding mistakes, but from confronting them with humility, accepting responsibility, and seeking forgiveness. Life often separates us from those who matter most, yet honesty, love, and forgiveness can heal even the deepest wounds if we have the courage to rebuild what was broken. Time passes quickly, and pride only leads to regret, while sincere apologies, open hearts, and the willingness to begin again can transform lives. Sometimes life grants a rare second chance, and embracing it with courage and gratitude can replace years of sorrow with a lasting legacy of love and redemption.